The Hague, Netherlands, a city synonymous with international justice. It was here, in the hallowed halls of the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, that a landmark ruling sent shockwaves across the world. The date was etched in history, January 12, 2024. The ICJ, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, delivered its verdict on the legality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories. The case, brought forth by the Palestinian Authority, had been years in the making. It was a culmination of decades of simmering tensions, punctuated by outbreaks of violence and a relentless cycle of suffering. The world watched with bated breath, the weight of expectation heavy in the air. The ICJ's decision, delivered with the gravitas befitting its stature, was unequivocal. Israel's occupation, the court declared, was illegal. The judges ruled that Israel's actions constituted a violation of international law, a breach of fundamental human rights, and a grave threat to international peace and security. The court's findings resonated far beyond the courtroom, reverberating through the corridors of power and echoing in the streets where ordinary people yearned for justice. The ruling was hailed by many as a victory for international law, a testament to the enduring power of diplomacy and the pursuit of peaceful resolutions. It served as a stark reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, the pursuit of justice must never falter. The ICJ's judgment was not a mere condemnation. It was a meticulous articulation of international legal principles. The court, drawing upon the Geneva Conventions and numerous UN resolutions, outlined specific obligations incumbent upon Israel. These obligations were not open to interpretation. They were the very bedrock of international humanitarian law, designed to protect civilians and uphold human dignity, even amidst the chaos of conflict. First and foremost, the court emphasized the imperative of prevention. Israel, as the occupying power, bore the primary responsibility for preventing acts of violence against the Palestinian population. This included, but was not limited to, preventing attacks by settlers, dismantling the illegal blockade of Gaza, and ensuring the safe and unimpeded access of humanitarian aid. Second, the court underscored the critical need for unimpeded humanitarian access to the occupied territories. The people of Gaza, subjected to a suffocating blockade for over a decade, were in dire need of essential supplies, medical care, and basic necessities. Israel's restrictions on the movement of goods and people, the court ruled, constituted collective punishment, a flagrant violation of international law. Finally, the ICJ emphasized the importance of transparency and accountability. Israel, the court declared, was obligated to conduct impartial investigations into all allegations of human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. Furthermore, the court called upon Israel to cooperate fully with international monitoring bodies and allow unimpeded access to the occupied territories. The ink on the ICJ's ruling was barely dry when the world watched in horror as the situation in Gaza escalated dramatically. The Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, citing security concerns and the need to respond to rocket fire from Gaza, launched a series of airstrikes on the densely populated Palestinian enclave. The world held its breath, hoping against hope that the ICJ's ruling would serve as a deterrent, that cooler heads would prevail. But the pleas for restraint fell on deaf ears. The bombs rained down on Gaza, targeting what the IDF described as militant infrastructure. However, the reality on the ground painted a far grimmer picture. Hospitals, schools, and residential buildings were reduced to rubble. The cries of children pierced the night, their small bodies buried beneath the debris. The international community condemned the violence, but words rang hollow amidst the carnage. The United Nations Security Council, paralyzed by political deadlock, failed to agree on a joint statement, let alone concrete action. The cycle of violence continued unabated, each explosion a stark reminder of the human cost of inaction. The bombing of Rafah, a densely populated city in southern Gaza, marked a particularly dark chapter in this unfolding tragedy. Hundreds of civilians, including women and children, lost their lives in a barrage of airstrikes that left the city in ruins. The international community watched in horror as the death toll mounted, the images of devastation seared into the collective conscience. The international community once again found itself grappling with the intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The ICJ's ruling, hailed by many as a watershed moment, had exposed the deep divisions that plagued the global response to the crisis. On one side of the chasm stood those who condemned Israel's actions as a blatant violation of international law, a war crime perpetrated against a defenseless population. Their voices, amplified by human rights organizations and humanitarian agencies, called for an immediate cessation of hostilities, targeted sanctions against Israeli officials, and an independent investigation into the bombing of Rafah. They argued that the international community had a moral and legal obligation to hold Israel accountable for its actions, to ensure that justice was served, and that such atrocities were never repeated. On the other side of the divide stood Israel and its allies, who defended the IDF's actions as a necessary response to Hamas rocket fire. They argued that Israel had the right to defend itself against terrorism, that the IDF took every precaution to minimize civilian casualties, and that the blame for the escalating violence rested solely on Hamas. Their voices, amplified by powerful lobbying groups and a sympathetic media, drowned out the cries for justice from Gaza. The United States, Israel's staunchest ally, blocked every attempt at the United Nations to censure Israel or impose sanctions. The European Union, divided and hesitant, issued lukewarm condemnations of the violence but failed to take any concrete action. The world watched, seemingly powerless to stop the bloodshed. Amidst the despair and the deafening roar of bombs, a faint glimmer of hope emerged. Civil society organizations, both in Israel and around the world, mobilized with remarkable speed and determination. Doctors, nurses, and medical supplies poured into Gaza through the Rafah border crossing, a lifeline for the wounded and the dying. Humanitarian aid workers, risking their lives to alleviate the suffering, worked tirelessly to provide food, water, shelter, and medical care to the displaced and the traumatized. Journalists, their cameras capturing the raw brutality of war, brought the human cost of the conflict into sharp focus, their images and stories piercing through the fog of propaganda. Artists, musicians, and writers from across the globe added their voices to the chorus of condemnation, using their platforms to raise awareness, inspire action, and offer solidarity. Protests erupted in cities around the world, from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Cape Town to Tokyo, as people took to the streets to demand justice for Palestine. The outpouring of support, while heartening, could not erase the pain and loss inflicted upon the people of Gaza. The scars of this conflict, both physical and psychological, would take generations to heal. Yet, in the face of unimaginable adversity, the human spirit endured, fueled by an unwavering belief in the right to self-determination and the pursuit of a just and lasting peace. The events in Gaza reverberated far beyond the immediate region, casting a long shadow over international law and the very foundations of the rules-based international order. The ICJ's ruling, once hailed as a triumph of international law, now served as a stark reminder of the limitations of legal pronouncements in the face of raw power and entrenched political interests. The principle of accountability, so central to the post-World War II order, seemed to have lost its potency. The international community, paralyzed by division and hampered by a lack of political will, appeared unable or unwilling to enforce its own laws and norms. The credibility of the United Nations, already strained by decades of inaction and double standards, suffered a further blow. The very notion of a rules-based international order, already under strain from the rise of nationalism and great power competition, seemed increasingly fragile. The events in Gaza served as a stark reminder that international law, without the backing of enforcement mechanisms and the political will to act, risked becoming little more than words on paper. The international community, faced with a crisis of legitimacy, was left grappling with fundamental questions about its own purpose and effectiveness. Could it muster the courage and the resolve to uphold its own principles? Or would it continue to stand by, paralyzed by inaction as injustice prevailed? The human cost of inaction was etched on the faces of the men, women, and children of Gaza. The bombs may have stopped falling, but the trauma lingered, a constant reminder of the horrors they had endured. The streets of Gaza, once bustling with life, were now scarred by destruction, the air thick with the smell of dust and despair. Hospitals overwhelmed with casualties struggled to cope with the influx of wounded. Doctors and nurses, working tirelessly amidst the carnage, faced agonizing choices, forced to prioritize patients based on the severity of their injuries. Medical supplies, always in short supply, dwindled with each passing day. Schools, once sanctuaries of learning and laughter, lay in ruins, their walls reduced to rubble. Children, robbed of their education and their innocence, bore the psychological scars of war, their nightmares haunted by the sounds of explosions and the sight of loved ones lost. The people of Gaza, their lives shattered by conflict, faced an uncertain future. The reconstruction efforts, hampered by the ongoing blockade and a lack of international support, moved at a glacial pace. The international community, its attention span notoriously short, seemed poised to move on, leaving the people of Gaza to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. In the aftermath of the bombing of Rafah, calls for accountability and justice echoed from the rubble. Human rights organizations, armed with meticulous documentation of alleged war crimes, demanded independent investigations and the prosecution of those responsible for the atrocities. Lawyers, citing international legal precedents, prepared to pursue justice through every avenue available, from national courts to the International Criminal Court. But the road to justice was long and arduous, fraught with legal complexities and political obstacles. Israel, citing security concerns and national sovereignty, refused to cooperate with international investigations. The United States, wielding its considerable diplomatic clout, shielded Israel from censure and accountability. The International Criminal Court, already facing accusations of bias and facing resistance from powerful states, found itself in a precarious position. To proceed with an investigation into alleged war crimes in Palestine risked a political backlash, potentially jeopardizing its already fragile legitimacy. The pursuit of justice, while essential for the victims and for the very foundations of international law, seemed elusive, a distant promise overshadowed by the realities of power politics and the entrenched interests of states. The international community, its commitment to accountability tested yet again, faced a stark choice: to uphold the principles of justice or to succumb to the expediency of realpolitik. The world watched as the events in Gaza unfolded. The images of destruction and despair beamed into living rooms across the globe. The internet, abuzz with news, analysis, and opinion, became a virtual battleground as supporters and detractors of Israel's actions clashed in cyberspace. Social media platforms, once hailed as tools of democratization and free speech, became amplifiers of misinformation and hate speech, further polarizing public opinion and hindering meaningful dialogue. The traditional media, grappling with the complexities of the conflict and facing accusations of bias from all sides, struggled to provide nuanced and objective coverage. The international community, bombarded with information and misinformation, found itself grappling with the challenge of discerning truth from propaganda. The lines between legitimate criticism of Israel's policies and anti-Semitism, often blurred by those seeking to silence dissent, became increasingly difficult to navigate. The events in Gaza served as a stark reminder of the power and the peril of the information age, a time when truth became a casualty of war and the pursuit of justice was often overshadowed by the cacophony of competing narratives. As the dust settled in Gaza, the international community was left to contemplate the long and arduous road ahead. The ICJ's ruling, while a significant legal victory for the Palestinian people, had failed to deliver the promise of justice or to break the cycle of violence. The bombing of Rafah served as a stark reminder of the human cost of inaction and the urgent need for a just and lasting peace. The path forward, though fraught with challenges, was clear. The international community, if it was to salvage its credibility and uphold the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, had to act decisively and with unwavering resolve. The first and most pressing priority was to address the immediate humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The blockade, which had turned the Gaza Strip into an open-air prison, had to be lifted. Humanitarian aid, in the form of food, water, medicine, and essential supplies, had to be allowed to flow freely into Gaza. The international community had to provide the necessary financial and logistical support to rebuild homes, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure destroyed during the conflict. But addressing the immediate humanitarian crisis, while essential, was not enough. The root causes of the conflict, the occupation, the settlements, the denial of Palestinian self-determination, had to be addressed if there was to be any hope of a lasting peace.